In today's video, we're taking a look at the latest trade talk surrounding disgruntled Oilers winger Jesse Puljujarvi. We've had reports saying there might be multiple teams interested in acquiring the winger, including teams like Montreal, Ottawa, and the Florida Panthers. Plus, longtime NHL forward Ales Hemsky has officially announced his retirement from pro hockey, and Pens forward Dominic Simon is going to be out for an extended time as well. We're going to jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of news topics to cover today. Let's kick things off with the news that Pens forward Dominic Simon is going to be out for action for a long time, probably 6 to 7 months. It was reported by the Pittsburgh Penguins that he ended up having surgery at the end of April. I guess we're just finding out this news now. It was a couple weeks back for a torn labrum. So he had to have shoulder surgery to repair that. And that's a big surgery. We've seen in multiple NHL players in the last few years have that type of surgery. And it's like I said, it's a big deal. They run into a lot of long-term rehab before they can get back on the ice. So the estimated return is about 6 to 7 months. So obviously, if the NHL is able to return to complete the 1920 season, it's a given that Dominic Simon will not be as part of the Penguins lineup here if they're able to get back on the ice. So obviously, we know that they were also without top forward Jake Guentzel for an extended time due to shoulder surgery as well. I would imagine, though, the likelihood of him returning is much greater. Obviously, I mean, Guentzel, I think, was expected to likely, maybe be back around June. I think it was progressed that if they were to make it as far as like the conference finals or Stanley Cup finals, that there was a possibility at least he could be back. I'm not sure how his rehab has gone due to the season being on pause. There really hasn't been as much talk around certain players and injury updates and that type of thing that we'd normally get more regularity with, but clearly the Penguins are going to be down shorthanded. If they can get Guentzel back, it certainly would soften the blow with Simon being out, but still another long-time injury there for the Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, as I mentioned as well, longtime NHL forward Ales Hemsky has officially announced his retirement from pro hockey. Now, he hasn't been in the NHL for some time. Of course, he had a long career spanning 11 seasons with the Edmonton Oilers. He was a first-round pick of theirs way back in 2001. I think you can describe the career of Ales Hemsky as being good but not great. I always thought he had just a little bit more potential in there that he lived up to. He was a solid offensively gifted player, played some great junior hockey in the QMJHL, leading into getting drafted, going into the NHL to Gatineau Olympiques back in the Q, and had some terrific offensive numbers. Obviously went into the Oilers, and for a long time there was one of their better, stronger offensive players. But I always just felt there was another gear that it was there. The skill level was there. Just never seemed to quite accomplish that. After those 11 years came to an end, he ended up getting traded to the Ottawa Senators, where he went on for a pretty solid run. He put up I think it was 17 points in 20 games to finish out the year in Ottawa. I really thought there was a pretty good chance he would re-sign and stick with them, especially where he was familiar with the area after playing a couple of years of junior hockey in Gatineau, which is right next door to Ottawa. There was a lot of talk he would stay. Ales Hemsky ended up leaving via free agency and signing with the Dallas Stars. Of course, his line mate from his time in Ottawa, Jason Spezza, was traded to Dallas that same year, so they ended up being reunited in Dallas, although they didn't really end up playing together nearly as much. Their time in Ottawa was pretty good together, but never really recreated that magic down with the Stars organization. He signed a 3 or 4 year deal down there, stayed there, ended up finishing out his career on a 1-year deal with Montreal, where he only got into 7 games, got hurt, and never really came back, spent the season on injured reserve, and that was all she wrote. So he had a pretty good career, but like I said, not as great as it could have been. I always felt there was another level there, another gear that he could have found to really elevate things even further. But still a pretty good hockey player, had a pretty good career, and he's now officially headed into retirement. Now, as I mentioned as well, I want to talk about disgruntled Oilers forward Jesse Puljujarvi, who has been coming up a lot in trade rumor talks over the last day or so. A lot of talk about the Oilers possibly moving him. Now, I know we did touch on him a few days ago as well, with all the chatter around the 2020 NHL draft possibly taking place here in June, coming up in a few weeks or in a month's time. There's been a lot of talk. Maybe the Oilers would look to move him, but of course, the story on what could happen with the NHL's return has been kind of going back and forth all week. We really don't have any clear-cut answers at all. We're hoping, based on what we're hearing, that the NHL will kind of give us more clarity and hopefully come to some some decisions next week. At least some GMs seem to be optimistic that that's going to take place, but there's not a guarantee right now that we have a June draft. I know we've seen some insiders saying that the odds are getting less and less more that they're not going to happen. It's going to get bumped out, but I guess we'll have to wait to remain to be seen, because if the draft does get bumped, then that very well could decrease the odds of this trade happening sooner than later, and it could push it later into the year once we're getting closer to the following season, or once we officially have an NHL offseason. But the three teams in different conversations from different articles that keep popping up around this player are Florida, Montreal, and possibly Ottawa. I know with the Montreal Canadiens situation, it makes a lot of sense that they would make that type of acquisition. Now, as we've discussed before, Habs GM Marc Bergevin has stockpiled a lot of draft picks as well. A lot of deals that he's made the last couple of years has really deepened the cupboard here of picks for the Montreal Canadiens, and I'm sure he had absolutely zero intention of using them all for the 2020 NHL draft. Clearly, Bergevin was stockpiling these picks in order to use them as currency to gain some other NHL players to fill some roster gaps and maybe make some draft day trades. I'm sure that's exactly what he was doing, but as it stands, if they proceed with the June draft, then the Montreal Canadiens' plan is going to be kind of sabotaged here. Bergevin is going to have all those picks, and he could look to package them together to maybe move up in certain draft rounds or whatever, but he's not going to be able to do what he had intended for. So it's still possible, though, that he could package up a couple picks for a player like Puljujarvi. He's one of the few players that could be traded if the draft is held in June, since he didn't play in the NHL this year and he's not on an active NHL roster, so there wouldn't be any limitations that way. I mean, they have multiple second and third round picks that they can look at packaging up to acquire him. Of course, they have some other pretty good young Finn players like Jesperi Kotkaniemi and Arturi Lehkonen. He could certainly fit in well with the culture of Montreal. Might be able to get some chemistry going with Kotkaniemi as center. Maybe at some point they can have an all Finn line. Hard to say, but it certainly would make sense that they would be a team who could take a chance on the young Finnish forward to see if he can get anywhere near what he was expected to be when he was drafted 4th overall just a few years back. He went back over to Liga in Finland this year and had a really solid year, was one of the league's top players, regained a lot of his confidence, regained his offensive stride, and it makes a lot of sense that he would be wanting to make the jump back to the NHL when hockey resumes, especially for next year, and to see what he can accomplish and get his career back on track. So Montreal certainly makes a lot of sense in some capacity here with the number of picks that they certainly would be looking for. Now, another team as well that was dropped around was the Ottawa Senators, with the fact that another team like Montreal that were in stockpiling picks over the last number of years. They've had a mass exodus of top players leave their organization, and Pierre Dorion has really done a pretty good job, in my opinion, of amassing a lot of picks and prospects in return. And they, like Montreal, I'm sure do not want to be able to use all of them for drafting players. You can only have so many prospects in your system. You can only have so many of them under contract. Only so many of them will make your team. At some point, you want to package some of this stuff up together to try to bring in other pieces to help your roster in other ways and get some more experience established NHL players, whether it be a veteran or maybe a young player who needs a fresh scenery, or depending on the situation, there's all kinds of things you can do. Either way, it gives you lots of trade chips to work with at your disposal. I believe it was Jim Matheson on Twitter wondering if the Ottawa Senators would consider parting with their first-round pick they got in the Pajot trade from the New York Islanders for Jesse Puljujarvi. And I have to say, I really don't think so. I mean, in his opinion, he thought if the Oilers were going to trade the Puljujarvi to the Senators around a draft day trade, that it might take a first-rounder to get him. I'm not really so sure that that's to be the case, that that's what it would take for one, and I'm really not convinced that the Senators would want him bad enough to give up that first-round pick. I mean, I know this first round of the 2020 draft's pretty deep, and I would imagine they're going to use all of those selections. Now, they do have a plethora of second and third round picks. They have 6 picks between those 2 rounds. Wouldn't be surprising if they came back and offered a second and a third, maybe 2 seconds, but that might even be too steep. It's hard to say. I mean, I know that the Oilers are expecting a pretty decent return given the fact that he was the 4th overall pick, but you also got to remember that that's long enough ago that his stock, certainly has dropped, and it's going to be a bit of a project and a potential here. Not a guarantee he's going to be the player many thought he would be, although based on how he played in Finland this past year, there's certainly a greater possibility of that than there was a year ago. And when many of people were labeling him a draft bust. So it does make sense for Ottawa to make an acquisition. I think it does. They have lots of young players for him to compete with. All kinds of young talent there that's on the rise, so it makes sense that he would get an opportunity as early as the coming season. They have all kinds of draft picks they could use to part with, and it might make sense for them to make that acquisition. So I guess we'll take a look at the third option here, and you can tell me which one you think is best. Now, the other option that's been brought up, and I've seen this on multiple forums and different articles, was the Florida Panthers, and there's some talk that they might be willing to trade a prospect or two of their own in order to bring Puljujarvi down to join the Panthers organization. Now, the Panthers are a team who have a pretty deep forward group, but there was a lot of talk near the NHL trade deadline that management was told by ownership to cut salary and to kind of decrease what they were spending, which explains partially at least why the Vincent Trocheck trade happened when it did to the Carolina Hurricanes, and they have some free agents like Mike Hoffman, Evgeny Dodonov, and there's a lot of talk that either one or both of them may not be able to be returned because the Panthers may not want to spend as much as they had in the past. Plus, with a flat salary cap or possible lower salary cap, they're going to be in tough anyways within the contracts that they already have in place. So even if ownership was willing to spend to the cap, it would still be a bit of a challenge to get all those contracts looked after. But having a guy like Puljujarvi in your lineup would be another guy on a cheaper contract that could help alleviate that, and maybe he could outperform what they're paying him. It's hard to say. We won't know until he comes back and gives it another try at the NHL level. But the article I read they actually referenced the fact that they might be willing to move Owen Tippett, who's another player who's been in their system for a few years. But, I mean, Owen Tippett made the jump to pro hockey last year, had a pretty solid American Hockey League season, scored 20 goals, and I think would be primed to jump into the Panthers lineup next year. I'm not completely convinced they would trade Tippett for Puljujarvi, at least not straight up. I mean, Tippett, I think, has a ton of potential. He's a little bit more of a pure goal scorer. I think he has the potential to be, a pretty solid sniper at the NHL. I'm not sure how high of a level we're going to get to here, but, to be a 20-goal man regularly, I think, is a possibility, and I can see how the Oilers would be interested in the type of player that he is. I'm just not convinced that the Panthers are willing to move him just yet, but a player that they might be willing to move, or a combination thereof, would be Henrik Borgstrom. There's been recent talk that he very well might end up going back to Finland this year. Of course, Borgstrom came to North America, had a couple of seasons at the University of Denver, got drafted, had some really solid numbers there, had a pretty solid college career for the few years he was there, signed his pro contract, got off to a decent start, but not fabulous, and this past year ended up spending pretty much all year in the American Hockey League, and then there's been reports that have surfaced recently suggesting that Borgstrom could end up back in Finland, especially where he hasn't been getting the opportunity at the NHL level this past year. So he's kind of starting to fall into that same kind of category as Puljujarvi, except he hasn't officially asked for a trade. There was some remarks from his agent after those reports came out suggesting that that was by far not a given that was going to happen, and Borgstrom was happy to help the Panthers in whatever way he could and remain in North America, especially if the season gets back underway to complete the 1920 season, and that's really all he was focused on for the time being, which makes a lot of sense for them to make those remarks. Doesn't mean he wouldn't consider going back next year, depending on what opportunity he may or may not get with the organization. But considering how old he would be now, I believe he's 23 years of age, he's a player looking for an opportunity, and if he's not getting it, he's going to be looking elsewhere soon enough. So it might make sense for them to maybe swap guys. They're both finished prospects. They're both looking for more of an opportunity, and they both have a lot of potential based on what they've done in the past at other leagues and other levels. So it might make sense for them to do a swap in that regard. So I guess that would be a whole different kind of trade rather than getting picks in return. But I guess let's see what the Oilers would be interested in. They may be more interested in Tippett than Borgstrom, but that might not be what the Panthers are willing to give up. We don't have any inside information to suggest these trade talks are going on, but there's a lot of talk amongst NHL reporters and insiders that the Oilers are ramping up some ideas here on how to possibly trade Puljujarvi, and these are some of the most likely scenarios that they feel are possible that we could see unfold once we get to an NHL draft in 2020 or potentially later into the offseason. So out of these three scenarios, I guess if you're the GMs and you had to pick one of them, which one do you think is the most likely landing spot that would be best for Puljujarvi, what makes best sense for the team that's acquiring him, and what do you think would be the outgoing package to make the trade happen? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and we can continue discussing further. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.